The night stretched endlessly before Sergeant Emily Carter as she sat slumped in her patrol car, her eyes flicking with a mix of boredom and disdain toward the glowing dashboard clock. It was well past midnight, and the oppressive silence of the shift weighed heavily on her. To her, this forsaken neighborhood was a graveyard of ambition, a place where time seemed to have abandoned all hope. Rows of dilapidated buildings lined the streets, their boarded-up storefronts and peeling paint a testament to neglect. The air hung thick with stagnation, as if the very atmosphere had given up on renewal. Emily sighed deeply, her breath fogging briefly in the cool interior of the car. She saw the people here as lost souls, trapped in cycles of poverty and despair, unwilling or perhaps unable to claw their way out. In her mind, they were beyond redemption, and she had long since stopped expecting anything meaningful to happen on these dreary patrols. Her thoughts wandered, drifting through the haze of her own cynicism, when something jolted her back to the present. Under the faint, flickering glow of a street lamp on the corner, a solitary figure stood motionless. It was a black woman, her silhouette stark against the dim light, exuding an air of quiet solitude in the dead of night. She was wrapped in a bulky, weathered coat that swallowed her frame, a wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over her face. In one hand, she clutched a worn bag, her fingers adjusting it now and then as if to steady herself. Emily tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as a familiar unease crept into her chest. Something about this woman felt off, out of place, to calm for a night so still and empty. Suspicion flared in Emily's mind, mingling with the prejudice she carried like a badge ugly. Ingrained belief that people like this woman were trouble waiting to happen. Why would she be standing there, alone, at this hour? Emily's lips tightened into a grimace. To her, it was a red flag, a signal of mischief brewing beneath the surface. This neighborhood, in Emily's eyes, was a breeding ground for chaos full of people she dismissed as lazy, quick to point fingers at their circumstances rather than fix them. She'd seen it all before: petty theft, smuggling, drug deals gone sour. The woman's presence at this ungodly hour only fueled her assumptions. Maybe she was hiding something in that bag. Maybe she was waiting for someone here, running from something. Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her pulse quickening with the thrill of authority. She didn't hesitate long. With a sharp turn of the wheel, she guided the patrol car to the curb, the engine's low hum fading into silence as she switched it off. She wanted to catch the woman off guard, to maintain the upper hand. The door creaked open, and Emily stepped out, her boots striking the pavement with a deliberate, commanding thud that echoed through the deserted street. Each step was a declaration of control, her posture radiating the confidence she'd cultivated over years of wearing the uniform. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even turn her head. She just stood there, gazing down at her feet, her stillness almost defiant in its serenity. Emily's frown deepened as she closed the distance, her sharp eyes dissecting every detail: the way the woman's fingers curled around the bag's handle, the frayed edges of her coat, the way her hat dipped low to shield her expression. To calm, Emily thought. To unbothered. It gnawed at her, this lack of reaction. She was used to people shrinking under her gaze, their eyes darting away, their voices trembling. But this woman, she didn't seem to care that a police officer was bearing down on her. Emily's chest tightened with irritation. She lived for the power her badge gave her, the way it bent people to her will, the way it silenced defiance before it could even form. Under Lieutenant Jack Harrow's protective wing, she'd handled countless troublemakers without so much as a whisper of consequence. That unshakable sense of dominion pulsed through her now, urging her to assert herself, to make this woman acknowledge who was in charge. Clearing her throat with a loud, intentional rasp, Emily stopped a few feet away, her shadow stretching long and dark under the street lamp. The woman still didn't move, her composure unshaken, and that only stoked Emily's frustration higher. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the night like a blade, cold and unyielding. She took another step forward, shrinking the space between them until she could feel the faint warmth of the woman's presence. In the chilly air, Emily wanted her to feel cornered, to see the flicker of doubt or fear she was so accustomed to drawing out. But the woman Sarah, as Emily would soon learn, finally lifted her head, and her eyes met Emily's with a quiet, piercing clarity. "I'm just on my way home," Sarah said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a gentle strength that seemed to fill the empty street. "I picked up a few things, that's all." She raised the bag slightly, letting the faint light catch its mundane contents: a loaf of bread peeking out, a small carton of milk. There was no tremor in her words, no hint of apology or alarm. Her bright eyes gleamed softly under the brim of her hat, serene and unflinching, as if she had nothing to hide and no reason to cower. To Emily, it was infuriating. That calm gaze felt like a slap, a silent rebuke to the authority she wielded so proudly. She was used to people crumbling, offering stammered excuses, forced smiles, anything to appease her. But Sarah stood there, unshaken, her presence radiating a quiet dignity that Emily couldn't bend. "It's too late for that," Emily snapped, her tone sharpening as her discomfort swelled. "Don't you know standing around at this hour looks suspicious?" She leaned in closer, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes boring into Sarah's, searching for a crack in that maddening composure. But Sarah didn't waver. "I have the right to be here," she replied, her voice still soft but resolute, each word measured and clear. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm just heading home." The simplicity of her response, the unwavering calm in her eyes, sliced through Emily's pride like a knife. She wasn't used to Thisamione staring back at her without fear, without submission. Sarah's gaze held a depth, a knowing that seemed to peel back Emily's bravado and expose the anger simmering beneath. Emily's jaw clenched, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She could feel her control slipping, unraveling in the face of Sarah's quiet defiance. "Who do you think you are?" she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Standing here like you own the place, acting like I don't have the right to question you?" She stepped closer still, her boots scraping the pavement, her presence towering as she tried to drown Sarah in the weight of her authority. But Sarah didn't shrink. She didn't step back. "I don't need to act any different just because it's late," she said, her tone steady. Her eyes still locked on Emily's. "I know my rights. I'm not doing anything to be afraid of." That was the breaking point. Emily's chest heaved as anger surged through her, hot and wild. Sarah's calm, her refusal to bend, felt like a direct challenge not just to her authority, but to the very power she'd built her identity around. She wanted to see Sarah falter, to watch her eyes drop, to hear her voice crack. But Sarah stood firm, her serene expression unshaken, her quiet strength a mirror reflecting Emily's own unraveling. In that moment, Emily glimpsed something unsettling. Her badge, her uniform, her years of unchallenged control, they meant nothing to this woman, and that realization burned. It wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about what she represented, a reminder that power, when wielded unjustly, could be met with a force far greater, dignity. The lesson lingered in the air, sharp and unspoken. Emily's abuse of authority, fueled by prejudice and pride, had collided with Sarah's unyielding integrity. The consequences weren't loud or immediate: no arrests, no shouts, but they were profound. Sarah's quiet stand stripped Emily bare, exposing the fragility of a power built on intimidation rather than justice. For all her years on the force, Emily had never faced a reckoning quite like this. A lone woman on a dark street, armed with nothing but her truth, teaching her that true authority isn't demanded, it's earned. And in that stillness, under the flickering street lamp, Emily felt the weight of her own failures pressing down, a silent warning of the cost of letting power corrupt. In the stillness of the night, beneath the faint glow of a flickering street lamp, Sarah stood like an unshakable pillar, her posture radiating a quiet defiance that seemed to mock the very air around her. She wasn't trembling, wasn't cowering, her eyes held a steady, piercing calm that sliced through the oppressive tension like a blade through silk. Across from her, Emily loomed, a figure draped in the arrogance of her authority, her chest puffed out as though her badge alone could bend the world to her will. The deserted street stretched out endlessly behind them, its cracked pavement and shadowed corners bearing silent witness to the clash unfolding under the dim, yellowish light. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken words, and every breath seemed to carry the weight of a storm about to break. Emily's pride was a living thing, pulsing beneath her skin, fed by years of commanding obedience and silencing dissent. She stood there, shoulders squared, her dark uniform crisp and imposing, believing herself untouchably a queen in her own mind, wielding power like a scepter. Her voice, when she spoke, dripped with venom, each syllable a calculated attempt to dominate. "Who do you think you are?" she snarled, her lips curling into a sneer as she glared at Sarah. She expected no demanded reaction, a flinch, a stutter, a crack in the other woman's armor. But Sarah gave her nothing. Nothing but that serene, unyielding gaze, cold as frost on a winter morning, and it gnawed at Emily's insides like a splinter she couldn't reach. Sarah's composure wasn't just defiance, it was a mirror, reflecting Emily's bluster back at her and exposing its fragility. Her brown coat fluttered slightly in the faint breeze, her hands steady at her sides, her face illuminated by the street lamp's weak glow. She stood tall, her silhouette cutting a sharp line against the darkness, as if she were carved from stony a mountain, enduring the fury of a tempest. Inside, Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, but she'd steeled herself for this long ago. She'd seen women like Emily before, drunk on power, blind to consequence, their egos towering yet brittle. Her heart beat steadily, each thump a reminder of her purpose, her resolve a quiet fire that no amount of shouting could extinguish. Emily's breaths grew ragged, her frustration mounting with every second Sarah refused to bend. Her fists clenched until her knuckles whitened, the leather of her gloves creaking under the strain. She couldn't stand it, this woman, this nobody, standing there as if Emily's threats were nothing more than wind rustling dead leaves. The rage boiled up inside her, a wildfire scorching through her veins, and she lunged forward, her hand shooting out to seize Sarah's arm. Her grip was iron, her fingers digging into the fabric of Sarah's coat as she yanked, trying to force her down, to make her kneel, to prove that her authority still held sway. "You'll regret this," Emily hissed, her voice low and guttural, her face inches from Sarah's. She wanted to see fear, to hear a whimper, anything to reclaim the control slipping through her fingers. But Sarah didn't budge. Her arm tensed under Emily's grasp, but her feet remained planted, her body an unyielding wall. Her eyes locked onto Emily's, and in their depths flickered a subtle, almost imperceptible defiance, a spark that said she'd expected this, that she'd prepared for it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of a car engine fading into the night. Emily's pulse hammered in her ears, her chest heaving as she searched Sarah's face for weakness and found none. That absence of fear, that unshakable strength drove her to the edge. She'd never met anyone like Thessalonian who didn't quake before her rank, who didn't bow to her threats. It was maddening, intoxicating, and it lit a fuse deep within her. Without thinking, Emily reared back and struck Sarah across the face, the crack of skin against skin echoing down the empty street. Her hand stung from the impact, but the satisfaction she'd craved didn't come. Sarah swayed slightly, her head turning with the force of the blow, a faint red mark blooming on her cheek. Yet she didn't cry out, didn't stumble, didn't even flinch. Slowly, she straightened, her gaze returning to Emily's with the same icy calm as before. It wasn't the stillness of defeat, it was the quiet of someone who'd seen this coming, who'd braced herself for the storm and emerged unscathed. Inside, Sarah felt the sting radiating across her face, a dull ache pulsing beneath her skin. But she buried it deep, her training kicking in like a second heartbeat. This wasn't about pain, it was about justice, about standing firm when others would crumble. Emily's bravado faltered. A shiver raced down her spine, cold and unfamiliar, as if the night itself had turned against her. She'd expected the slap to break Sarah, to shatter that infuriating calm. But instead it felt like she'd struck a wall, and the wall had struck back in silence. Her mind raced, questions tumbling over one another. Who was this woman? What was she hiding? The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and for the first time, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in years: fear. Her hand hovered midair, trembling slightly, as Sarah's own hand moved with deliberate slowness toward her coat pocket. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting to follow the motion. Time seemed to stretch, each second a lifetime, as Sarah's fingers closed around something small and metallic. She pulled it out with care, her movements precise, almost ceremonial, and held it up under the street lamp's faint light. The object glinted, a badge, its surface catching the glow and throwing it back in sharp, accusing shards. An FBI emblem stared back at Emily, its edges gleaming like a guillotine blade, and the world tilted beneath her feet. Her mouth fell open, her chest tightening as if an invisible hand had clamped around her ribs. The badge wasn't just a symbol, it was a reckoning, a mirror reflecting every abuse, every overstep, every moment she'd thought herself invincible. "My name is Agent Sarah Barnes," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the silence like a judge's gavel. It was calm, measured, but laced with an edge that could slice through steel. "I'm investigating abuse of power and corruption within your police department." Each word landed like a stone, heavy and deliberate, sinking into the pit of Emily's stomach. She wanted to speak, to scream, to deny it, but her throat was a desert, her tongue leaden. Her eyes flit between the badge and Sarah's face, those same steady eyes. Now alight with purposing, the realization crashed over her like a tidal wave. She'd misjudged everything. The woman she'd tried to break wasn't a victim, but a hunter. And Emily had just stepped into her trap. Panic clawed at her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The authority she'd worn like armor dissolved into ash, leaving her exposed, vulnerable. A child caught in a lie. Her legs wobbled beneath her, the pavement cold and unforgiving against her boots. She'd always had Lieutenant Harrow's protection, a shield against complaints and whispers. But now that shield felt like a paper wall against a hurricane. "You're an FBI agent," she managed to choke out, her voice a frail, trembling thing, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. She clung to a desperate hope that the badge was a forgery, that this was some elaborate bluff, but Sarah's gaze offered no mercy, no crack of doubt to slip through. "Yes," Sarah replied, her tone unwavering, her eyes boring into Emily's soul. "And I'm here to investigate your abuse of authority." The words were a verdict, a sentence handed down in the quiet of the night, and they stripped Emily bare. She felt the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her, a mountain of arrogance and cruelty she'd built brick by brick, now crumbling at her feet. The street lamp flickered above, casting jagged shadows across her face, and the world blurred into a haze of fear and regret. She'd thought herself untouchable, a force above the law. But Sarah stood there as justice incarnate, her presence a reminder that power misused would always demand a price. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its sound sharp and fleeting, pulling Emily's attention for a fleeting moment. It was a small thing, a mundane interruption, but it grounded her just enough to steady her racing thoughts. She remembered the late-night meetings with Harrow, the hushed deals in smoky backrooms, the officers who'd turned a blind eye because they feared Harrow feared him. She'd reveled in it, the control, the loyalty she'd demanded, the way people shrank before her. Now, those memories twisted into chains, binding her to a fate she couldn't outrun. Sarah's lips curved into a faint, knowing smirk, not cruel, but cutting all the same. "Did you think you could get away with this forever, Emily?" she asked, her voice steady as a drumbeat, each word a nail in the coffin of Emily's pride. "That your abuses of power would stay buried, that no one would dare shine a light on them." The scorn in her tone was subtle but sharp, a blade slipped between ribs, and Emily felt it deep in her core. She'd always believed she was untouchable, that her badge and her connections were a fortress no one could breach. But Sarah had been watching, waiting, a shadow in the periphery, gathering every thread of evidence until the tapestry of Emily's corruption was laid bare. "I was just doing what I had to," Emily stammered, her voice cracking as she scrambled for footing on ground that no longer held. To keep order. "In a place like this, if you're not firm, it all falls apart. You wouldn't understand." The excuse tasted bitter on her tongue, a flimsy shield against the truth staring her down. She could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, the dampness seeping into her collar, and she hated how small she sounded, how weak. Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable but her eyes glinting with something fierce. "Order," she echoed, the word dripping with disdain. "Is that what you call it when you intimidate and bully? When you twist the law to feed your ego, to make yourself feel invincible?" Her voice rose just enough to carry the weight of her accusation, and Emily flinched as if struck again. "I've seen your kind before, people who think power is a toy, who forget it comes with responsibility. But the thing about justice, Emily, is that it doesn't bend. It waits, and then it strikes." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and Emily felt them settle into her bones. She lowered her head, her shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of her. The street around them seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer, the silence pressing against her ears. She thought of her career, the late nights, the promotions, the fear she'd instilled, and how it had all led to this moment, standing across from a woman who'd unraveled her with nothing but truth and a badge. Sarah wasn't just an agent, she was a force, a reckoning Emily hadn't seen coming until it was too late. For Sarah, this was more than a confrontation, it was the culmination of months of watching, listening, piecing together the rot within the department. She'd walked these streets in plain clothes, sat in diners overhearing whispered complaints, studied the files of citizens too scared to speak up. Every bruise she'd seen, every tearful story she'd heard, fueled the fire in her chest. She'd known Emily would lash out eventually, like people like her always did, when their illusions of control were threatened. And now, standing here, badge in hand, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not in the victory, but in the clarity it brought. Justice wasn't loud or vengeful, it was steady, unrelenting, and she was its vessel. Emily's world had shattered, the pieces scattered across the pavement like broken glass. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath hitching as the reality sank deeper. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and the consequences loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Sarah's gaze never wavered, a beacon of accountability that Emily couldn't escape. The lesson was brutal and clear. Power, when wielded without restraint, invited its own downfall. And as the night stretched on, the two women stood there, one a symbol of justice unbroken, the other a cautionary tale of arrogance undeveloped in a moment that would echo far beyond the empty street. In the heart of a bustling city, where the hum of life pulsed through every street, a real police officer stood as a guardian of the peoply, figure of strength and resolve, tasked with shielding the innocent rather than wielding authority as a weapon to wound or inflate their own ego. Emily, however, had strayed far from that ideal. At that moment, a searing flush of heat surged through her body, a volatile blend of fury and humiliation that set her cheeks ablaze. Her heart thundered against her ribcage, each beat a desperate plea to break free from the suffocating weight pressing down on her soul. She stood trapped, cornered by the stark realization that every lifeline she'd clung to whispered assurances of protection from her superiors. The invisible armor she'd worn so confidently had dissolved into thin air, fragile as soap bubbles bursting under the piercing light of truth. Her gaze flickered toward Sarah, a fellow officer whose presence now loomed like an unyielding storm cloud. Emily's lips parted, her voice trembling as it fought to emerge, softer and more fragile than she'd ever allowed it to be. "You have to understand, Sarah," she murmured, her words laced with a plea she barely recognized as her own. "Sometimes there's no other choice. Sometimes force is the only way." Her chest tightened as she spoke, a faint hope flickering within her that Sarah might soften, might see the world through her eyes. But Sarah's stare cut through her like a blade, unwavering and resolute, her brown eyes glinting with a mix of disappointment and steely determination. "Force," Sarah's voice sliced the air, sharp and unsparing. "Or is it just you feeding your own ego? Emily, I've watched you long enough. There's no excuse or no twisted logic that can justify what you've done." Emily's body quaked, a shiver rippling through her as her eyes darted away, unable to bear the weight of Sarah's judgment. Memories clawed their way to the surface of vivid, haunting flashes of the wide-eyed, terrified faces of those she'd intimidated, their pleas for mercy echoing in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. How long had it been since she'd lost sight of her purpose? She'd once sworn to protect, to serve, yet somewhere along the way, she'd morphed into the very tyrant she'd once scorned, a shadow cloaked in a badge, wielding power not for justice, but to quench her insatiable thirst for control. The bitter truth gnawed at her, each realization a splinter embedding deeper into her conscience. Sarah's voice returned, colder now, cutting through the haze like a winter gust rattling bare branches. "Did you know, Emily, that Lieutenant Harrow exhausted himself trying to bury your messes? Every time you crossed a line, he scrambled to shield you. But not anymore. No one can save you now. The truth is out, and every crime you thought you'd buried is rising to the surface." Each word landed like a stone, piling onto the knot twisting tighter in Emily's chest. She glanced up at Sarah, her vision blurring with a chaotic swirl of confusion and desperation, searching for a crack in her accuser's armor. But Sarah stood there, immovable as a granite statue, her silence a deafening roar that needed no elaboration. Emily's fate was sealed. She would answer for her sins. In that suffocating moment, the enormity of her fall crashed over her like a tidal wave. For years, she'd leaned on the scaffolding of power, exploiting the loyalty of those above her to mask her injustices. Now, that flimsy structure had collapsed, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Fear, primal and unfamiliar, coiled around her heart, its grip tightening with every breath. "Justice," Sarah added, her tone low but brimming with unshakable resolve, "won't let you slip away this time, Emily. Every move you made, every abuse of power, it's all been documented. It's evidence now, stacked against you. There's no running from this. You'll face the consequences, whether you're ready or not." Emily's head bowed, her shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of despair. Tears stung her eyes, pooling until they spilled over, tracing hot paths down her face. Words failed her. Every defense, every justification she'd once wielded like a shield crumbled to dust in her throat. She'd lost it all, her authority, her freedom, the fragile veneer of self-respect she'd clung to. Before she could fully grasp the depth of her ruin, a sudden commotion erupted around her. FBI agents materialized from the shadows, emerging from every direction like specters summoned by her reckoning. Their boots struck the pavement with deliberate force, the sound reverberating through the tense air as they closed in, encircling her with methodical precision. She stood frozen, a statue of defeat amidst the chaos, her breath shallow and ragged. These weren't just any agents, they were a breed apart, immune to the manipulation and intimidation she'd once wielded so effortlessly. Each step they took pulsed with purpose, dismantling the last vestiges of the dominance she'd reveled in for so long. The scene unfolded like a grim theater production, one where she'd unwittingly cast herself as the tragic lead, a role she'd never auditioned for, but could no longer escape. She willed herself to remain composed, to hold her fracturing mask in place, but inside, a tempest of emotions churned: panic, regret, defiance, warring for dominance before collapsing under the agent's piercing stares and unyielding grips. The truth loomed undeniable, a monolith she could no longer sidestep. Control, her faithful companion through years of schemes and domination, had slipped through her fingers like sand. She'd once thrived as the puppet master, pulling strings with other officers to bend reality to her will, twisting facts, silencing dissent, crushing anyone who dared defy her. Now, the agents before her embodied justice in its purest form, their mission singular and unrelenting: to hold her accountable, leaving no crevice for her to slither through. Dread cloaked her like a second skin, its icy tendrils seeping into her bones. Emily, who'd once gripped power with an iron fist, now stood alone, dwarfed by a reality she could neither bend nor break. Her mind spiraled back to the faces of colleagues she'd roped into her web, officers like Mark, a weary man with a nervous laugh who'd followed her orders out of fear, or Clara, a rookie whose idealism Emily had exploited until her bright eyes dulled with resignation. She'd orchestrated it all, fearless in her pursuit of dominance, blind to the wreckage she left behind. But now, as cameras flashed and whispers rippled through the growing crowd, the weight of their judgment bore down on her. She caught glimpses of familiar face, former allies turned spectators watching her unraveling, with a mix of shock and disdain. To them, she was no longer a figure of authority but a common criminal, stripped bare by her own hubris. Her voice trembled, yearning to rise in her defense, to weave one last thread of defiance. But the words lodged in her throat, heavy and useless. The agents drew closer, their movements synchronized, a slow march that signaled the end of her reign. Then came the cold, unyielding bite of handcuffs against her wrists, a sensation so jarring it snapped her back to reality with a clarity that made her head spin. The metal dug into her skin, a tangible reminder of the consequences she could no longer outrun. The sharp click of the cuffs locking pierced the stillness, a sound that echoed like a gavel's strike, sealing her fate and shattering the empire she'd built on sand. Memories flooded her mind, unbidden, innocent faces she'd exploited, their trust betrayed by her calculated lies, promises she'd spun to shield her reputation, now unraveling like frayed thread. Each act of cruelty, each moment she'd turned a blind eye to compassion, returned to haunt her, their weight pressing down until she could scarcely breathe. As she was guided toward the police car, each step reverberated through the hushed crowd, amplifying her isolation. Those who'd once flocked to Hersom with admiration, others with envy or fear had melted away, leaving her with a void that swallowed her whole. Solitude, a presence she'd dismissed in her arrogance, now stood beside her, an unshakable companion as cold as the steel encircling her wrists. Her legs faltered, trembling beneath her as though rejecting the path she was forced to tread. The officers' gazes detached, unfeeling, stripped away her defenses, each look a mirror reflecting the truth she'd evaded for too long. There was no retreat, no shadow to cower in, no lie to cloak her sins. Her world, once a towering fortress of control, lay in rubble, taking with it the woman she'd fought to become. Justice, relentless and impartial, had caught her at last, its lesson etched into her soul. Power abused breeds its own downfall, and no badge could shield her from the consequences of her own making. As Emily sat in the back seat of the police car, the oppressive silence wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, heavy and unrelenting. The low, steady hum of the engine, a sound so ordinary in another life, now reverberated through her skull, amplifying the storm of emotions churning within her. Fear gripped her chest, tight and unyielding, while resignation settled into her bones like a cold ache she couldn't shake. Her mind, restless and unmoored, wandered back to the tangled web of choices she'd woven, the missteps, the arrogance, the moments of reckless defiance that had delivered her here, to this cramped, unforgiving space. She could almost see herself as she once was, bold, unapologetic, standing tall with a pride she'd wielded like a gleaming sword. But now, that pride lay shattered at her feet, revealed for what it truly was, a fragile illusion that had guided her straight into ruin. The realization burned in her throat, a bitter taste she couldn't swallow. As she grappled with the stark truth, the very thing she'd treasured had been her undoing. Her thoughts spun in chaotic circles, torn between regret and a stubborn flicker of denial that refused to die. Could she have chosen differently? If she'd tempered her recklessness, softened her edges, would the outcome have shifted? The questions gnawed at her, relentless and cruel, prying open the fissures in her psyche where shame and remorse had long festered, ignored in the shadows of her bravado. She hadn't just hurt herself, oh no, the damage rippled far beyond her own skin. Faces flashed before her eyes, colleagues who'd trusted her implicitly, friends who'd believed in her unwaveringly, young officers who'd once looked up to her with wide-eyed admiration. Now she pictured their disappointment, their betrayal, and the pain she'd inflicted throbbed through her, radiating from her chest down to the tips of her trembling fingers. It was a constant, aching reminder of the lives she'd fractured with her selfish ambition. As the car lurched forward, its tires crunching against the gravel, Emily's gaze dropped to her hands, clenched tightly in her lap. A faint tremor danced across her knuckles, a betrayal of the control she'd once prided herself on. Desperate to escape the tidal wave of guilt crashing over her, she tried to anchor herself in the mundane, the rough weave of her jacket, scratching against her arms, the icy chill seeping through the window and prickling her skin, the mechanical clatter of the car's gears shifting. But no matter how hard she clung to those distractions, the truth cut through like a blade sharp, cold and inescapable. The world she'd built, brick by brick, with all its towering ambitions and glittering desires, had crumbled into dust. The life she'd once claimed as her own was gone, reduced to jagged shards she could no longer piece together. For the first time in years, Emily let the walls she'd so carefully constructed fall away. Vulnerability crept in, raw and unfamiliar, stripping her bare. It was as though the armor she'd forged, layered with pride, polished with defiance, had melted under the weight of her actions, leaving her exposed to the full, unfiltered force of her mistakes. There was no one left to impress, no audience to dazzle with her carefully curated image. The fortress she'd built around herself, once a symbol of strength, now felt like a cage she'd locked herself inside long before the handcuffs ever touched her wrists. In a twisted way, she'd been a prisoner all along, shackled by the choices she'd made, bound by the consequences she'd dismissed with a wave of her hand. Gazing out the window, she caught her reflection in the glass, a ghostly, blurred figures staring back at her with hollow eyes. That woman, the one she used to be, had been fueled by relentless ambition, chasing success with a hunger that left no room for doubt. But now, all Emily saw was a void, an emptiness where dreams once blazed. A stranger lost in the wreckage of her own making. Her breath hitched, shaky and uneven, as a quiet acceptance settled over her like a heavy fog. The road ahead stretched out, long and desolate, a lonely path she'd walk with no promise of redemption. In the stillness of that car, Emily understood she'd face this journey alone, accompanied only by the ghosts of her past, echoes of every wrong turn, every prideful miscalculation. When the vehicle finally rolled to a stop outside the police station, she was ushered out, her wrists released from the biting grip of the handcuffs. Yet the red, angry marks lingered on her skin, stark symbols of a fall she could no longer deny. Stepping into the holding cell, she stood motionless in the narrow, suffocating space. The gray walls, chipped and peeling, loomed around her, and the air carried a damp, sour stench that clung to her lungs. Here, stripped of every title she'd once worn like a crown officer, leader, authoritish, was nothing more than a criminal, ensnared by the very consequences she'd once scoffed at. The day's earlier scenes replayed in her mind, vivid and merciless. She saw her colleagues, since her comrades, her confidants, watching her with eyes hardened by judgment as she was marched through the station's sterile hallways. Their faces, once warm with camaraderie, had twisted into masks of disdain. Some turned away, refusing to meet her gaze, while others stared openly, their sneers and mocking smiles carving deep wounds into her already battered spirit. She could still hear the whispers, the sharp edges of their words slicing through her. How could she? She thought she was untouchable. Each glance, each muttered barb, drove her further into isolation, a pit of despair she couldn't climb out of. Sinking onto the cold metal cot, she curled into herself, her head buried in her hands as if she could shield herself from the reality pressing in. But there was no hiding from the memories that flooded back every instant, where she'd flexed her power without hesitation, every fearful face she'd dismissed with a smirk, every plea she'd ignored in her relentless pursuit of control. She'd once reveled in that dominance, convinced she stood above the law, above morality itself. Now, in the dim solitude of the cell, those memories returned like specters, haunting her with the weight of every misdeed. Night fell, and the silence grew eerie, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance, and the scuffle of footsteps beyond the bars. Every sound seemed magnified, a cruel reminder of the loneliness that engulfed her. Lying on the cot, Emily stared into the blackness, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath shallow and ragged. The future loomed before her, a gray, shapeless expanse filled with shadows and uncertainty. The woman she'd once been, strong, proud, unbreakable, is gone, her honor and dignity stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell adrift in regret. From the hallway, the murmur of voices drifted in, other officers, her former peers, dissecting her rest with biting sarcasm. "Can you believe it?" One sneered. "She thought she'd get away with it forever," another added, his laugh cold and cutting. Each word pierced her, dismantling the last vestiges of the pride she'd clung to, reducing her to a small, trembling figure beneath their scorn. In that crushing solitude, Emily realized she'd lost far more than her freedom, the life she'd once defended so fiercely, her career, her reputation. Her identity had slipped through her fingers, leaving only remorse and a future shrouded in doubt. Days dragged on, each one heavier than the last, and a creeping dread tightened its grip around her heart. Her thoughts turned to Lieutenant Harrow, her former superior, a towering figure whose influence had once been her shield. Harrow wasn't just a boss, had been the puppet master pulling strings behind the department's curtain, his cold, calculating presence a constant in her rise to power. She could still see his steely gaze, the way his eyes seemed to bore into her soul during their clandestine meetings, reading her every thought with unnerving precision. Emily knew the stakes. If she dared breathe a word about Harrow's role in her crimes, the consequences could be fatal. That fear coiled around her like a noose, dragging her deeper into a spiral of paranoia and helplessness. Harrow's shadow lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder of the cost of betrayal. She remembered the hushed conversations in his office, the way he'd lean back in his chair, exuding an effortless authority that made her feel both invincible and expendable. He'd never raised his voice, didn't need to. His control was absolute. His warnings delivered in quiet, measured tones that carried the weight of a death sentence. Now, trapped in the cell, Emily saw the lesson etched into every moment of her downfall: justice, though slow, was unrelenting, and the abuse of power carried a price that spared no one. Her arrogance had blinded her, but the truth had finally broken through, leaving her to face the wreckage alone. The cell's damp walls seemed to close in tighter, and as she lay there, the echoes of her past mingled with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. A symphony of consequences she could no longer escape. Emily sat in the suffocating stillness of her cell, the air thick with the weight of her own dread. For years, she had thrived under the shadow of Lieutenant Harlow, a man whose grip on power was as unyielding as iron. He had orchestrated a labyrinth of alliances, weaving a network of loyalty and fear that kept him untouchable within the police department. Even now, with her wrists aching beneath the cold bite of handcuffs, Emily could feel his influence pressing down on her. It was as though invisible eyes tracked her every shallow breath, every trembling gesture, waiting for the moment she'd falter. The fear gnawed at her, a relentless beast that refused to relent. It wasn't just Harlow she feared, it was the legion of officers bound to him. Men and women who wore their badges like shields for his secrets. They'd do anything to protect him. She knew that much. A single misspoken word, a fleeting glance toward the FBI agents circling her case, and she'd be finished. Harlow wasn't the type to hesitate. He'd snuff out any threat to his reign, even if it meant burying someone who'd once stood by his side. The tension coiled tighter in her chest with each passing day, a suffocating knot she couldn't unravel. Emily wasn't the woman she'd once been: bold, unshakable, proud. That version of her had crumbled, replaced by someone who flinched at every echo in the hallway beyond her cell door. The department she'd trusted, the life she'd built, had morphed into a menacing trap. Faces she'd once greeted with a nod now loomed in her mind as masks of betrayal, each one hiding a dagger aimed at her back. Every sound a distant footstep, the faint clink of keys, even the soft hum of the flickering fluorescent light overhead sent a shiver racing through her. It was as if Harlow's enforcers were already closing in, their whispers of warning or promises of violence carried on the stale air. She felt like a hunted animal, cornered with no path forward and no way back, her every instinct screaming that safety was a dream she'd never reclaim. Her hands clenched into fists, the red welts from the handcuffs stinging as a bitter reminder of her fall. A chill slithered down her spine, and she bowed her head, letting the memories flood in. She'd done terrible things to claw her way up, to hold on to the power that once made her feel invincible. Each act of cruelty, each time she'd twisted the truth or silenced an innocent voice, had fueled her rise. Back then, it had felt like triumph of every trembling victim. Every falsified report, every life she'd bent to her will had been a brick in the fortress of her pride. But now, those moments replayed in her mind like a relentless, slow-motion nightmare. Faces of the people she'd wronged stared back at her, their silent accusations piercing deeper than any blade. The power she'd chased had turned to ash, leaving only guilt and isolation in its wake. She was utterly all no allies, no friends, just the hollow echo of her own regrets. Emily understood now that one wrong move, one desperate grasp for escape, could bring Harlow's wrath crashing down on her. She lifted her gaze to the cracked walls of her cell, the dim light casting jagged shadows that seemed to mock her. All she'd built, all she'd fought for, had been a mirage, a fragile illusion shattered by the weight of her own choices. Meanwhile, beyond the bars of Emily's prison, Sarah and the FBI team moved with relentless purpose. The moment Emily was locked away, they'd launched into action, knowing this wasn't just another case, it was a descent into a cesspool of corruption that ran deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The police department became their battlefield, a sprawling maze of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Sarah led her agents through dusty file rooms where the air hung heavy with the scent of old paper and deceit. They pried open locked drawers, their gloved hands trembling with anticipation as they sifted through years of buried evidence. Every corner held the promise of revelation, not just proof to convict Emily, but fragments of a system so rotten it threatened to collapse under its own lies. In the basement, behind a false wall that groaned under their touch. They stumbled upon a hidden room. The space was cramped and dank, the smell of mildew clinging to the air like a shroud. Rows of files lined the shelves, each one meticulously labeled with dates and case numbers. A chilling archive of Harlow's empire. Sarah's breath caught as she pulled the first folder free, her fingers brushing the faded ink. Page after page unveiled a tapestry of abuse beatings covered up, witnesses coerced into silence, evidence scrubbed from existence. The records were a monument to the corruption Harlow and Emily had nurtured, each line a testament to the lives they'd shattered. Sarah's anger flared as she read on, her hands shaking with fury. She could almost hear the echoes of the victims' pleas, feel the weight of their fear as officers like Emily twisted justice into a weapon. The brutality laid bare in those files wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of everything the badge was meant to stand for. The investigation pressed deeper, peeling back layers of Harlow's reign. Secret emails surfaced, their curt words dripping with arrogance as Harlow instructed Emily on how to bury their tracks. Keep the reports clean, he'd written in one, his tone as casual as if he were ordering coffee. It's all handled. Then there were the recordingtious voice crackling through static, laced with a mocking laugh as he bragged about a case he'd made vanish. No trace, he'd chuckled, the sound chilling Sarah to her core. Those words haunted her as she uncovered more, hushed phone calls plotting cover-ups, orders to tamper with evidence, threats against anyone who dared to speak. It wasn't just Harlow, and a milli-dozens of officers were tangled in the web, their voices a chorus of complicity. There was Officer Daniels, a weary man with a nervous tic, who'd falsified statements with a surgeon's precision. Detective Merrow, broad-shouldered and gruff, had intimidated whistleblowers into silence, his growl a weapon of its own. Each played their part, a well-oiled machine designed to keep Harlow's power intact. The evidence painted a broader picture, one that made Sarah's stomach churn. Harlow hadn't just shielded his allies, turned the department into his personal fiefdom. Internal investigations bent to his will. Officers like Emily protected no matter how blatant their crimes. There were even whispers of payoffs cash slipped into his hands for handling cases. Rewards for bending the law to suit the highest bidder. Justice, Sarah realized, had been a hollow word here. A flimsy curtain draped over a stage of greed and brutality. Yet with every file she opened, every recording she transcribed, her resolve hardened. She felt a fierce pride swelling within her, a fire stoked by the knowledge that she was tearing down a facade no one else had dared to touch. This wasn't just about evidence, it was about clawing back the truth from a system that had forsaken it. Still, the deeper she dug, the heavier the burden grew. Sarah's nights stretched long, her eyes burning under the flicker of office lights as she pieced together the puzzle. Each discovery brought a rush of triumph, but also a creeping dread. She knew the stake. Harlow's reach was vast, his allies ruthless. Figures lurked in the shadows, ready to strike if she pushed too far. Yet she couldn't stop. This was more than a case, it was a reckoning. The corruption she'd uncovered wasn't just a stain, it was a cancer eating away at the heart of justice. Emily and Harlow weren't mere criminals. They were emblems of a rot that had festered too long. Sarah took a steadying breath, the weight of her mission anchoring her. She'd fight on, no matter the cost, because the lesson was clear. Power abused brought ruin, and justice, though battered, could still rise from the ashes. In the stillness of the night, the creeping dread that had taken root in Sarah's heart only deepened. She sat alone, hunched over her cluttered desk in a dimly lit office, surrounded by towering stacks of files and flickering shadows cast by a single, weary lamp. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, pulling her back to the faces of those who had dared to approach the truth, colleagues with furrowed brows and informants with trembling voices, all of whom had whispered fragments of the conspiracy before vanishing into an abyss of silence. No letters, no calls, no trace, just gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The weight of their absence pressed against her chest, a suffocating question echoing in her mind. Would she, too, dissolve into that same void? Was she prepared to gamble everything, her safety, her very life, for the mission that now consumed her? Fear gnawed at her, its cold fingers wrapping around her racing heart. But beneath it burned something fierce, a resolve forged in the fire of outrage. Sarah's hazel eyes, weary yet unyielding, drifted to the photographs pinned to her wall, innocent faces marred by the scars of corruption, families shattered like fragile glass, lives reduced to ashes by the greed of those in power. She could still hear the echoes of a mother's sobs from an interview months ago, the woman's hands clutching a faded picture of her missing son. The thought that justice might slip through her fingers, leaving these victims defenseless, was unbearable. It was a torment that clawed at her, driving her forward even as every shadowy figure she glimpsed in the corner of her eye, and every cryptic warning scrawled on torn paper urged her to turn back. She couldn't will to let these crimes fade into the darkness unpunished. Night after night, Sarah pored over the evidence in her quiet sanctuary, the hum of the city beyond her window drowned out by the rustle of pages and the scratch of her pen. Ink smeared across her hands, staining her fingertips black as she traced connections between names, dates, and placed each link a thread in the sprawling web of deceit spun by Harlow and Emily. The deeper she dug, the clearer their brutality became, ruthless schemes cloaked in authority, lives crushed under the weight of their ambition. With every revelation, her determination swelled, a tidal wave crashing against the shores of her doubt. She could see the path stretching out before her, jagged and treacherous, a road that threatened to unravel her career and snuff out her life. Yet she pressed on, her spirit steeled by the stakes she carried. In fleeting moments of weakness, when exhaustion blurred her vision and the silence grew too heavy, Sarah's thoughts turned inward. She reminded herself why she fought. This mission mattered more than her own fears. She was up against forces far greater than herself, shadowy titans who bent laws like twigs and twisted justice into a mockery of itself. That very enormity fueled her. If she faltered now, if she let intimidation silence her, the corrupt would triumph, and every year she'd devoted to the pursuit of righteousness would crumble to dust. The stakes were personal, too. Her mind wandered to the people she loved, her parents, her childhood friend Anna, the brother who always teased her for working too hard. She distanced herself from them, skipping dinners and dodging calls, hoping to shield them from the storm she'd walked into. But guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. She could still see the worry etched into her mother's face the last time they'd met, the unspoken questions hanging in the air when she'd brushed off yet another family gathering. They didn't understand her obsession, and how could they? This was a solitary crusade, a burden she'd chosen to bear alone. As the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Sarah's emotions churned like a tempest. What had begun as a job of duty had morphed into something far more visceral. This was her fight now, a crucible that tested the core of who she was. Fear still lingered, a ghost whispering doubts in her ear, but it was eclipsed by a steely resolve that darkened her gaze. She pictured the day it would all end, Harlow and Emily dragged into the light, their masks of power torn away, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. The system they'd warped would be cleansed, its integrity restored. That vision sustained her, a beacon in the fog of uncertainty. She was ready to risk it all to face whatever horrors lurked ahead, because justice demanded nothing less. But then, in the midst of her relentless digging, a phone call shattered the stillness. The shrill ring cut through the quiet, and as she lifted the receiver, a colleague's voice crackled through, tight with urgency. "Sarah, it's Emily. She's dead. Found in her cell." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, stealing her breath. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, her mind spinning in a chaotic whirl of anger, grief, and a hollow, sinking helplessness. She abandoned her desk in a rush, papers fluttering to the floor behind her as she grabbed her coat and stumbled into the night, the city's neon glow blurring past her in a haze. When she reached the police station, the air felt thick, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of secrets too heavy to voice. Stepping into the cell, Sarah froze. Emily lay motionless on the narrow cot, her body rigid against the cold concrete. Her wide, glassy eyes stared upward, locked in an expression of raw terror, as though she'd seen her fate descending in her final moments. The room was unnaturally still, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, just an eerie, meticulous order that screamed of something sinister. The silence wrapped around Sarah like a shroud, amplifying the thud of her own heartbeat. She approached slowly, her boots echoing against the floor, each step a battle against the dread pooling in her stomach. Standing over Emily, She felt a tidal wave of sorrow crash over her. Despite the woman's sensed betrayal, the abuse of power, no one deserved this lonely, frigid end. Sarah's hand hesitated before brushing against Emily's icy fingers. A futile gesture of connection to a life now extinguished. Emptiness yawned within her, a void where Emily's secrets, ambitions, and regrets had once thrived, now lost forever. For a moment, Sarah's thoughts drifted to Emily's journey's choices that had led her to this grim cell. She'd been a player in Harlow's game, a pawn who'd risen to high and seen too much. But pity quickly gave way to fury. This wasn't a random tragedy or a desperate act of self-destruct. No, this was murder calculated, cold and deliberate. Harlow had orchestrated it, snuffing out Emily to protect his empire of corruption. It was a message, carved in blood and silence, meant for Sarah. Back off, or your necks. Her jaw tightened, her fists clenching until her knuckles whitened. Rage surged through her, a wildfire she couldn't contain. Harlow thought he could break her, that this display of ruthlessness would send her running. He was wrong. As she turned from Emily's lifeless form, her gaze swept the dim hallway beyond the cell. A cluster of officers lingered there, their faces pale, their voices hushed in nervous murmurs. They avoided her eyes, their unease palpable. They knew or suspected the truth, yet fear sealed their lips. The station itself seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with unspoken loyalty to a system gone rotten. Frustration swelled in Sarah's chest as she took in the scene. She'd pinned her hopes on Emily, believing her testimony could crack Harlow's network wide open. Now, with her death, a piece of the truth had slipped away, buried beneath layers of manipulation and power. It felt like sand trickling through her fingers, her grip on justice weakening with every passing second. She replayed their last encounters in her mind, Emily's cryptic hints about evidence, the flicker of dread in her eyes whenever Harlow's name surfaced. In death, she'd become another casualty of the corrupt, a stark reminder of how fragile justice could be when pitted against unchecked power. Harlow's shadow loomed larger now, a dark specter taunting her with the cost of her defiance. Yet that very threat ignited something within her, a defiance that burned brighter than her fear. His warning was clear, his power undeniable, but Sarah wasn't one to bend. To topple Harlow, she'd need more than determination alone. She'd need unshakable evidence, loyal allies, and a strategy with no cracks. As she stepped away from the cell, she cast one final glance at Emily, her lifeless form a silent plea for retribution. In that moment, Sarah made a vow not just to herself, but to every victim Harlow had crushed. Emily's death wouldn't be another victory for him. It would be his undoing. With every fiber of her being, Sarah swore to press on, no matter the cost, even if it meant staring down the full force of Harlow's wrath. The familiar hum of the station faded behind her as she walked into the night, her resolve a blazing torch against the encroaching dark. Justice wasn't just a goal anymore, it was a reckoning, and she would see it through. The air outside the police station hung heavy with an almost dreamlike stillness, as if reality itself had paused to catch its breath. Inside Sarah's chest, a spark flickered to life, a fierce, unyielding resolve that rooted itself deep within her soul, a force no shadow could snuff out. Emily's death lingered in her mind like a relentless specter, haunting every quiet moment. Whenever Sarah closed her eyes, she could still see Emily's lifeless form, her final moments etched in stark, unmerciful detail. A tidal wave of regret crashed over her, drowning her in the gnawing thought that she might have done more, might have pulled Emily back from the abyss. It was a wound that refused to heal, a silent accusation she couldn't shake. Sarah understood with chilling clarity that Harlow had been the architect of it all. He'd woven his web with the precision of a master craftsman, each thread placed just so, leaving no loose ends, no telltale signs for anyone to unravel. His every step had been measured, his every decision a cold calculation to ensure his tracks vanished into the ether. Sitting alone in her dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of files and the faint hum of a flickering bulb, Sarah traced the contours of her loss. Emily wasn't just a colleague, she was a mirror reflecting Harlow's ruthless ability to bury justice beneath layers of deception. Her death carved a hollow space in Sarah's heart, a stark reminder of the cost of his unchecked power. Yet, amid the ashes of that tragedy, Something unyielding took shape within Sarah. If Harlow thought silencing Emily would break her, he'd misjudged her entirely. Alone with her thoughts, she felt a fire ignitia blazing determination that drowned out the whispers of doubt and fear. She would push forward, chasing even the faintest glimmers of evidence, wielding every tool at her disposal to drag Harlow's shadowy empire into the unrelenting light of day. As she pored over the case files, her fingers tracing the edges of worn pages, she made a vow to herself. This wouldn't fade into the forgotten corners of history. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about every soul crushed beneath Harlow's heel, every life warped by his corruption. Justice demanded more than retribution. It demanded a reckoning for the powerful who believed themselves untouchable. The days after Emily's death stretched into a blur, but Sarah's purpose sharpened with every passing hour. The evidence she'd painstakingly gathered began to form a clearer picture, peeling back the layers of Harlow's carefully constructed facade. It wasn't just abuse of power, it was a sprawling, subterranean network he'd nurtured over years, a labyrinth of loyalty and fear that kept him insulated from consequence. Alongside her FBI team, Sarah devised a plan to bring him down. They all knew the odds stacked against them. Harlow had ruled the police department like a king on a throne of thorns for too long, his influence seeping into every corner. But the stench of injustice had grown too thick to ignore, and Sarah felt the weight of that truth pressing her onward. When the morning arrived, cloaked in a damp, silvery mist, Sarah led her team with a quiet intensity. They slipped into the building where Harlow held court, their movements synchronized down to the smallest gesture, every breath a testament to months of preparation. The air inside was thick with tension, the hallways lined with officers whose loyalty to Harlow ran deep, men and women ready to shield him at any cost. But Sarah had mapped every contingency, her mind a steel trap that left no room for error. Her boots struck the floor with purpose, each step reverberating through the corridor like a drumbeat of inevitability. She could feel the eyes of Harlow's guards on her, their unease palpable, but she pressed forward undeterred. When she reached his office, the door swung open to reveal Harlow seated behind his desk, a king surveying his dwindling domain. For a split second, surprise flickered across his sharp features, gray eyes widening before he schooled them into a mask of composure. But Sarah caught it, that fleeting glint of fear, the crack in his armor. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint smirk, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You thought you could keep running, didn't you, Harlow?" She held up the arrest warrant, her grip steady, her tone ironclad. "Every scrap of evidence we've uncovered lays your sins bare. This ends today." Harlow let out a dry, hollow laugh, his gaze dripping with disdain as he tilted his head. "You really think you can take me down, Sarah? I've held this place together for years. No one's going to undo that, not you, not your little crusade for justice. You're just a speck, chasing a fantasy." His words were venomous, a desperate flex of a man clinging to his crumbling throne. But Sarah stood unmoved, her hazel eyes locked on his. "You've built an illusion of control," she replied, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Justice doesn't bend to men like you. It finds a way to shine through the lies. You can hide behind your power, but the truth always rises." Her words struck like arrows, piercing the fragile shell of his pride. A muscle twitched in his jaw, and a flicker of desperation danced in his eyes, signs of a man watching his empire teeter on the edge. He tried to hold his ground, his posture rigid, but the weight of the evidence Sarah carried was undeniable. She stepped closer, her presence towering despite her steady calm. "Every person you twisted, every life you shattered, every drop of power you stole, it's all coming back to you now. You built this kingdom on a foundation of deceit, Harlow, and today, you'll see it collapse." For a heartbeat, his defiance faltered. He opened his mouth to retort, searching for the composure that had once come so easily, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. Even his loyal officers, standing at the edges of the room, seemed to waver, their gazes shifting, as if glimpsing his weakness for the first time. The sharp click of handcuffs sliced through the tension as Sarah's team moved in, their motions swift and precise. As the cold metal locked around Harlow's wrists, Sarah felt a fleeting wave of relief wash over her, softening the fire in her chest. She'd spent months chasing his shadow nights, lost to sleepless study. Days spent piecing together whispers and fragments until this moment crystallized her efforts. They escorted him down the hallway, Sarah walking beside him, her eyes never straying from his face. Harlow twisted his head toward her, his voice dropping to a bitter hiss. "You think this is the end, don't you?" His words were a low growl, meant to unsettle her. She met his gaze without flinching. "For you it is. You spent years preying on the vulnerable, taking what wasn't yours. But power forged in lies always crumbles. Now you'll answer for it." His lips pressed into a thin line, his defiance flaring one last time. "People like me don't stay down, Sarah. There's always someone else ready to rise, no matter what your precious justice says." A faint smile curved her lips, sharp and knowing. "And people like me will always be there to make sure justice finds them. This isn't a game you can win, Harlow. You've lost." They emerged into the gray light of the morning, where a cluster of officers waited to take him away. Among them stood his former alliesmen who'd once followed him blindly, their faces now etched with disillusionment. They'd trusted him, built their lives around his promises, only to see the rot beneath the surface exposed. As Harlow was led to the waiting vehicle, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the weight of his fall sinking in. Sarah turned to her team, her voice steady but resonant. "This isn't just about one man's arrest. It's about proving that justice can't be silenced or sold. We're doing this for everyone he hurt, for every voice he tried to erase." Her words carried a quiet power, a reminder of why they'd fought so relentlessly. Jamie, a young agent with wide eyes and a rookie's earnestness, stepped closer. His voice tinged with awe. "I didn't think we'd ever get him, Sarah." "Not really." She offered him a small, weary smile, her gaze still piercing. "It wasn't luck, Jamie. It was grit. No matter how high someone climbs, there's always a way to hold them accountable. Don't forget that." Standing beneath the overcast sky, Sarah felt a burden lift from her shoulders, a weight she'd carried through sleepless nights and endless doubts. She'd poured herself into this case, sacrificing pieces of her own peace to see it through. Now, with the mist curling around her and the faint sound of Harlow's transport fading into the distance, a quiet satisfaction settled in her bones. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, a promise that even the mightiest could fall when their crimes caught up to them. And in that moment, Sarah knew she'd honored it. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the bustling streets outside the police station where Sarah stood, her heart pounding with a cocktail of emotions she could hardly untangle. Completing her mission hadn't just been about winning a personal battle, it was a blazing testament to her unshakable faith that justice, no matter how winding and treacherous its path, would always rise victorious in the end. She'd spent years clinging to that belief, and now, as she watched the world shift around her, it felt like a fire reignited in her chest. Before her unfolded a scene that clashed violently with everything Lieutenant Harlow had once embodied: unchecked power, a swaggering arrogance, and the smug certainty that he floated above consequence. For so long, he'd been a towering figure in her life, his icy glares cutting through her resolve, his dismissive words dripping with condescension during every briefing they shared. But today, that illusion shattered as she watched him stumble forward, flanked by officers. His once proud shoulders slumped under the weight of his reckoning. The crowd surrounding the station buzzed with life, a chaotic symphony of raw emotion spilling into the air. Their cheers roared like thunder, a collective release of years of pent-up frustration and fear. Faces lit up with relief, as if an invisible chain had snapped, freeing them from a burden they'd carried far too long. Some threw their arms around each other, tears streaking down their cheeks in quiet joy. Others thrust fists skyward, their shouts ringing with triumph. A few stood apart, silent and still, their eyes locked on Harlow, tracking his every faltering step with a mixture of disdain and quiet satisfaction. For Sarah, the moment was surreal, a tidal wave of feelings crashing over her vindication. Yes, but also a strange, fleeting pang of something softer, something she couldn't quite name. She'd once believed Harlow was untouchable, a man whose barked orders echoed with absolute authority. his presence filling every room with an oppressive weight. Now, he was nothing more than a broken shell, stripped bare of the power he'd wielded like a weapon. His heavy footsteps dragged across the pavement, each one seeming to pull him deeper into a void of his own making. His eyes fixed ahead in a desperate attempt to shield himself from the sea of judgment, bearing down on him. Sarah could sense it, though beneath that crumbling facade, Harlow felt every piercing stare, every whisper of contempt swirling around him. She remembered the countless times he'd flexed his authority, his voice booming over trembling subordinates in smoke-filled meeting rooms, his smirk daring anyone to challenge him. Those memories, once so vivid and intimidating, now dissolved into ash, meaningless in the face of his defeat. This wasn't just a fall from grace. It was the complete annihilation of the dominion he'd convinced himself was eternal. As the officers guided him toward the waiting car, a flicker of fear danced in his ice-net, just the terror of losing his rank, but the bone-deep realization that everything he'd clawed for, every empire he'd built on the backs of others, had crumbled into dust. Sarah's gaze lingered on him, and for a fleeting moment, a twinge of pity stirred within her. Harlow had once been a rising star, a lieutenant with a career others envied, his name spoken with awe in precinct hallways. But greed had twisted him, his insatiable hunger for control steering him down a dark road until all that remained was the scorn of those he'd trampled. Did he ever pause to imagine this end? Did regret ever gnaw at him in the quiet hours? Or had he truly believed his reign would never falter? The crowd erupted again as the police car door slammed shut, their cheers swelling into a powerful chorus of liberation. It wasn't just celebration, it was a defiant proclamation that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could never outlast the will of those it oppressed. Sarah stood amidst the noise, her chest rising and falling with a newfound clarity. Relief washed over her, yes, but it mingled with a fierce, burning resolve. This wasn't the end of the story, it was merely the opening chapter of a grueling journey ahead. Harlow might have fallen, but the rot he represented stretched far beyond him, a sprawling web woven into the very bones of the system. There were truths still buried, injustices yet to be dragged into the light, and Sarah knew she couldn't rest, not yet. As the police car vanished into the distance, she felt a conviction settle deep within her. Justice and truth would always find a way, no matter how fierce the resistance. Today had proven that, and it fueled her determination to keep pushing forward, to tear down every last vestige of corruption until the world reflected the fairness she'd always believed in. The cheers began to soften, but the energy in the air shifted into something more enduring, a quiet, unshakable trust in the power of righteousness. Sarah scanned the faces around her, each one glowing with a fragile but fierce hope for a future free from the shadows of men like Harlow. This moment wasn't confined to the station steps, it rippled outward, igniting protests and demands for change across the city. Voices that had once been silenced now rose in unison, a tidal wave of unity crashing against the old, decaying order. Harlow's former colleagues lingered nearby, their expressions a kaleidoscope of shame and revelation. Some had turned a blind eye to his tyranny, others had been coerced into silence. But now they couldn't unsee the truth. They watched their once mighty lieutenant reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that justice, though slow, was relentless. A few slipped away, heads bowed, their faces etched with regret for the years they'd let slide by. Others stood taller, pride flickering in their eyes as they realized the values they'd sworn to uphold had finally clawed their way to the surface. In that fleeting pocket of calm, Sarah tilted her head back, the vast sky stretching above her like a promise. A surge of determination pulsed through her veins, fierce and unyielding. The fight for justice would be a marathon, not a sprint, long, brutal, and littered with obstacles, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood the people, their courage a living flame, her investigative team, a band of relentless truth seekers and colleagues finally ready to step into the fray. She wouldn't stop here. This victory was a spark, and she'd fan it into a blaze until every hidden lie was exposed, until the system gleamed with the transparency it had long been denied. As she walked through the fading afternoon light, the air felt crisp and alive against her skin, a stark contrast to the storms Harlow had stirred. His downfall was a triumph, but it was only the beginning. There was work still to be done. battles yet to be fought, to ensure no one else suffered beneath the weight of unchecked power. Sarah's thoughts drifted to the future, to the children who'd grow up in a world she was helping to reshape, a generation raised on fairness, not fear. The crowd's fading cheers lingered in her mind, a melody of resilience and hope that drowned out the echoes of Harlow's reign. She wasn't just an agent anymore, she'd become a beacon, a steady light guiding her community through the darkest nights. The lesson was clear: justice might bend under pressure, but it would never break, and she'd stand as its defender, unwavering, until every wrong was righted. The story had reached its crescendo, a powerful testament to the inevitability of consequence, a warning to those who dared abuse their power that their time would run out. Harlow's fate was sealed not just by Sarah's tenacity, but by the collective will of a people who refused to bow any longer. Meanwhile, miles away, the cold winter night wrapped Pine Grove in a brittle stillness. The upscale neighborhood's grand houses loomed behind manicured hedges, their windows glowing faintly against the dark. It was nearing 11:30 p.m. when James Thompson eased his dark blue Toyota Camry down the quiet streets, his grip tight on the wheel, his breath shallow but controlled. He kept his speed steady, painfully aware that in this affluent, predominantly white enclave, his presence alone might raise suspicion. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror didn't surprise him, it was almost inevitable. With a slow, deliberate exhale, he pulled over beneath a glaring street lamp, its harsh light spilling across his car. He'd chosen this spot intentionally. Visibility was his shield. His pulse quickened, a drumbeat of nerves beneath his calm exterior, as he watched two officers emerge from their patrol car. Officer Ryan Collins, a lean young cop with just 3 years under his belt, approached the driver's side, his flashlight cutting through the night. His partner, Mike Brennan, a burly veteran with a weathered face, flanked the passenger window. Both men resting their hands near their holsters, a detail James clocked instantly. "License and registration, please," Collins said. His tone clipped as the beam of light swept over James's face, then down to his hands, still positioned precisely at 10 and 2. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" James replied, his voice steady, polite, every word enunciated with care. A faint flicker of surprise crossed Collins's face, as if he hadn't expected such composure. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," the young officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly, the weight of the night pressing down on them all. The night air hung heavy with tension as Officer Collins' voice softened slightly, though it still carried the weight of authority. "Your vehicle was creeping along at an unusually slow pace," he remarked, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man behind the wheel. James, seated calmly in the driver's seat, felt the faint hum of his car's engine beneath him, a steady rhythm against the growing unease of the moment. "I was just being cautious, officer," he replied, his tone even and measured, betraying none of the nerves that might have gripped another in his place. "I wanted to make sure I stayed within the speed limit." His right hand drifted deliberately toward his jacket pocket, each movement slow and deliberate as if he were navigating a minefield. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now, if that's okay with you," he added, his voice steady but laced with a quiet respect. From the passenger side, Officer Brennan's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, joining Collins' light to form a spotlight on James' every gesture. The twin beams danced across his hands, illuminating the faint tremble he fought to suppress, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could feel the officer's scrutiny like a physical force, their suspicion crackling in the air as he eased his wallet free and set it carefully on the dashboard. The leather gleamed faintly under the harsh glow, a small but deliberate act that seemed to hang in the silence. "Sir, I asked for your license and registration," Collins said, his voice sharpening with a flicker of irritation, the kind that comes from a long night of routine stops gone unexpectedly sideways. James nodded, his fingers hovering over the wallet. "Before I hand those over," he began, his words slow and deliberate, "I'd like to know if your body cameras are recording, officers." The question landed like a stone in still water. Rippling through the moment, Collins and Brennan exchanged a quick, wary glance, their faces shadowed by the dim streetlights filtering through the car windows. This wasn't the usual script. Most drivers fumbled for their IDs or muttered excuses. Not probed about protocol. Our cameras are always on during stops, sir, Brennan replied. His tone clipped as he leaned closer to the passenger window, his broad frame casting a looming silhouette. Now, please, show us your identification. James reached for the wallet again, flipping it open with the same careful precision, but he paused, his fingers brushing the edge of his license. Officers, he said, his voice soft yet firm, I want to be completely upfront with you. There's something I need to explain. It might sound out of the ordinary, and I'm asking for your patience. Colin's hand twitched closer to his holster, a subtle shift that didn't escape James' notice. Sir, stop stalling and show us your IDNO. The officer snapped, his patience fraying like a worn rope. James met his gaze, unflinching. I understand your concern, he said, his calm unshaken. But I'm in the middle of a delicate situation that requires discretion. I can prove who I am, but I'd prefer to do it at the station if that's an option. The words ignited a spark of alarm in both officers. Collins took a half step back, his stance widening into something more defensive, while Brennan's grip tightened on his flashlight, the beam wavering slightly. Step out of the vehicle, sir, Collins ordered, his voice now a low growl. James didn't resist. With a faint click, he unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements as deliberate as ever, and pushed the door open. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the distant sound of crickets and the faint hum of traffic. As he stepped onto the pavement, his polished shoes glinted under the streetlight's expensive leather, meticulously cared for, a detail that clashed with the officer's initial assumptions about the man they'd pulled over. Dressed in a dark sweater and crisp dress pants, he rose to his full height, over 6 feet tall, his posture straight and commanding, exuding a quiet dignity that seemed to unsettle the officers further. Place your hands on the hood of the car, Collins barked, while Brennan circled around to the rear, his boots scuffing against the asphalt as he positioned himself for backup. James complied, his palms pressing against the still warm metal, the engine's heat seeping into his skin. Officers, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. I want to be clear, I'm cooperating fully, but I need to maintain a level of confidentiality right now. I'm not refusing to identify myself, I'm just asking to do it through the proper channels. His composure was unnerving, his articulate words weaving a web of mystery around him. Collins and Brennan had seen it all: slurring drunks, nervous kids, furious executive. James didn't fit any mold. He was a puzzle they couldn't piece together, and it gnawed at them. Brennan's gruff voice broke the silence. We've had burglaries reported around here, he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied James' unflinching expression. And you're acting mighty suspicious, sir. Collins began a pat-down, his hands moving swiftly over James' frame, searching for anything to justify their growing unease. I get how this looks, James replied, his tone still steady, and I respect that you're doing your job. I'm just asking you to respect that I have my reasons for being careful. The search turned up no weapons, only a sleek, high-end phone and a card that looked like some sort of official. It's anything. James gently, but firmly declined to let them inspect closely. That refusal was the breaking point. Turn around, Collins snapped, pulling the handcuffs from his belt. You're under arrest for obstruction and suspicious activity. The metal clicked around James' wrists, cold and unyielding, but his face remained serene. A faint smile tugged at his lips, as if he'd anticipated this exact outcome and found some strange comfort in it. The back of the patrol car was a stark contrast to the night outside, cramped and chilly, the vinyl seat creaking under his weight. Yet James sat there with the ease of a man lounging in a luxury sedan, his gaze drifting to the window as the city lights streaked by. In the front, Collins and Brennan kept stealing glances at him through the rearview mirror, their confusion deepening with every mile. Most people they hauled in were a mess, yelling, pleading, or trembling. James was none of those things. Run the car's registration again, Collins muttered, his fingers tapping impatiently on the steering wheel. Brennan nodded, his thick fingers pecking at the patrol car's computer. The vehicle was tied to Marshall Industries, a name that rang no bells and offered no answers, a corporate ghost that only thickened the mystery. Something's off about this guy, Brennan grumbled, his voice low as he squinted at the screen. "Too calm. And those shoe toes are $1,000 dress shoes." In the back, James overheard every word, but his expression didn't shift. His eyes traced the route they were taking, a winding, unnecessarily long path to the station. He knew they were stalling, hoping dispatch would dig up something concrete before they arrived. The radio crackled to life. "Unit to 147. Be advised the vehicle's tied to a private corporate account. No further details without a warrant." The news only fueled the officers' suspicion, their grips tightening on their respective tool Skolins on the wheel, Brennan on his unease. Collins adjusted the mirror, locking eyes with James. "Sir, this would all go a lot smoother if you'd just tell us who you are," he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and curiosity. James met his gaze with a polite nod. "I appreciate your concern, officer, but there are procedures I need to follow. I'm fine going to the station." Brennan twisted in his seat, his broad shoulders filling the space. "Look, man, if you're some kind of undercover Fed or something, just say it. We're all on the same team here." James' smile widened slightly, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I understand your frustration. Let's just get to the station, please." Brennan's face flushed with irritation, a deep red creeping up his neck as he turned back around, shaking his head. When they pulled into the station lot, 3 more patrol cars sat waiting, their lights casting an eerie glow across the pavement. Word had spread fast about the enigmatic, well-dressed man who wouldn't give his name. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood at the entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as Collins and Brennan escorted James inside. Unlike her officers, she noticed the subtleties they'd missed, the way James carried himself with perfect poise, how his gaze swept the room like a predator assessing its territory. "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, her voice firm but tinged with curiosity as they led him toward booking. "Care to tell me what's going on here?" James dipped his head respectfully. "Sergeant, I'm sorry for any confusion. I'll cooperate with booking, but I need to make one phone call first. After that, everything will clear up." Rodriguez arched an eyebrow. Most suspects demanded their rights in a panic. James requested his with the calm of a man asking for a glass of water. "Process him first," she told her officers, "then he gets his call." The booking room buzzed with an odd energy as they took his fingerprints. The system beeped, then stalled, his results locked behind a security clearance neither Collins nor Brennan had ever encountered. His belongings offered no answers, just the pricey phone, a sleek wallet with no ID, and that cryptic card with what looked like an embedded chip. "Empty your pockets completely," Collins growled, his frustration boiling over. James reached into his jacket and produced a single Itima plain white business card. He handed it to Rodriguez with a small nod. "This is the number I'll need to call." She turned it over in her hands, her brow furrowing. No name, no title, just a Washington, D.C. area code and a string of digits. The simplicity of it felt heavy, loaded with unspoken significance. As they led him away, James' mind churned beneath his calm exterior. He'd known this might happen, had prepared for it, even. The officers saw a mystery, a threat, a man defying their authority. But to James, this was a lesson unfolding in real time. Power, when wielded without understanding, could blind even the well-intentioned. Collins and Brennan weren't villains. They were cogs in a system that demanded answers and punished ambiguity. Yet their rush to judgment, their reliance on force over patience, mirrored a deeper truth James had seen play out in boardrooms and backrooms alike. Justice, he thought, wasn't just about catching the guilty. It was about recognizing when to pause, to question, to listen. The cuffs on his wrists were cold, but they were also a reminder. Those who abused their power, however small, often sowed the seeds of their own undoing. And as the station lights glared down on him, James sat steady, waiting for the moment when the truth would turn the tables, not with anger, but with quiet, inevitable clarity. The night air hung heavy with tension as officers Collins and Brennan escorted James Thompson through the dimly lit corridors of the Pine Grove Police Station. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting long, flickering shadows on the cracked linoleum floor. James moved with an unshakable calm, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the ground. His hands clasped loosely in front of him as though he were strolling into a boardroom, rather than a holding cell. Behind him, the officers exchanged uneasy glances, their grips tightening on his arms not out of necessity, but from a growing sense that something about this arrest didn't add up. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood at the end of the hall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the procession with a furrowed brow. 18 years on the force had honed her instincts into something razor-sharp, and now those instincts screamed that this was no ordinary collar. James's demeanor too composed to deliberate gnawed at her as the officers guided him into the cell. He turned briefly, his voice cutting through the stale air like a blade. "That phone call will need to happen within the next 30 minutes, he said, his tone steady but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "After that, things might get complicated." His words lingered, heavy with implication. As the metal door clanged shut behind him, Rodriguez felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She waved a hand at Collins and Brennan, her voice sharp with authority. "My office, now. I want every detail of that traffic stop again, every word, every move." The two officers trailed her reluctantly, their boots scuffing the floor as they followed. She didn't miss the way Collins's jaw tightened or how Brennan's eyes darted toward the holding cell, as if expecting James to vanish through the bars. Inside her cramped office, Rodriguez sank into her chair, the springs creaking under her weight. Her desk was a chaotic sprawl of reports, coffee-stained mugs, and a single, pristine business card she'd confiscated from Jamesa Card bearing nothing but a Washington, D.C. phone number and a faint embossed seal she couldn't quite place. Through the smudged window behind her, she could see him in the cell, sitting on the edge of the bench with his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't pacing or muttering complaints like most detainees. He simply waited, his posture relaxed yet expectant, as though he were a guest at a dinner party who'd arrived fashionably early. "Run it through again," she ordered, leaning forward as Collins and Brennan shifted uncomfortably in the mismatched chairs. Across from her, Collins cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he began. "We pulled him over on Route 17, tinted windows, no visible registration. He wouldn't show ID at first, just handed us that card and said to call the number. Said it'd explain everything. When we pressed, he didn't resist, but he didn't comply either." "It felt off, ma'am." Brennan nodded, picking up the thread. He stayed calm the whole time to calm, like he knew something we didn't. The more they spoke, the heavier the air in the room grew. Rodriguez's fingers drummed against the desk, her mind racing. She'd seen plenty of strange cases in her career: drunk drivers, petty thieves, even the occasional mob runner, but this was different. This man wasn't afraid. He wasn't even inconvenienced. Her gaze flicked back to the card, its edges smooth under her fingertips. "I think we should make that call," Collins ventured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's not right here." Before she could respond, a sharp knock rattled the door. The night desk officer, a weary kid named Jenkins, who'd barely been on the job 6 months, poked his head in, his face pale. "Sergeant, you need to see this." He thrust a fax into her hands. The paper still warm from the machine, Rodriguez scanned the text, her breath catching as the words sank in. Her eyes widened, a rare crack in her stoic facade. "Get the captain on the phone," she snapped, her voice trembling with urgency. "Right now." Down the hall, James noticed the shift in the station's rhythm. Officers moved faster, their footsteps echoing with purpose. Whispers floated through the air, clipped and tense. He leaned back against the cold concrete wall, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His plan meticulously crafted, time to the second was unfurling like clockwork. He checked his watch, the sleek silver face glinting under the harsh lights. 2 minutes. He thought, just 2 more minutes. A young officer approached the cell, his keys jangling nervously. "Sir, would you like to make your phone call now?" James rose smoothly, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. "Actually," he said, glancing at his watch again, "that won't be necessary. In about 2 minutes, your captain should come storming through that door." The officer blinked, confusion etching deep lines into his youthful face, but before he could question it, the station erupted into chaos. Captain William Hayes burst through the double doors, his face flushed a furious red. He was still in his golf shirt, the collar askew, his gray hair disheveled from being yanked out of a quiet evening at home. "Open it." He barked at the officer, who fumbled with the lock in a panic. The cell door swung wide, and James stepped out, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Captain Hayes," he said warmly, as if greeting a colleague over coffee. "I'd apologize for the late-night interruption, but I think we both know this couldn't wait." Rodriguez stormed up behind Hayes, flanked by Collins and Brennan, who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Would someone please tell me what the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the clamor. Before anyone could answer, the station doors swung open again, admitting a tall woman in a razor-sharp suit. Her heels clicked with military precision against the floor, each step radiating authority. Two men in dark suits trailed her, earpieces glinting faintly in the light. "I'm Sarah Martinez," she announced, her voice crisp and commanding. "Chief of Staff for the Police Commissioner's office." She turned to James, her expression softening slightly. "Sir, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Sarah," James replied, smoothing his jacket as he stepped fully into the light. Everything went exactly as expected. Hayes swayed on his feet, looking like he might collapse under the weight of the moment. "Officers Collins, Brennan," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "You just arrested Dr. James Thompson Marshall, new police commissioner from D.C." The station fell silent, the air thick with shock. Collins froze, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, while Brennan's mouth hung open, his mind scrambling to process the revelation. Rodriguez closed her eyes, exhaling slowly as the pieces clicked into place. But James wasn't finished. His voice, now laced with undeniable authority, filled the room. "Actually," he said, turning to face the officers, "they did exactly what I wanted them to do." Sarah stepped forward, snapping open her briefcase with a practiced flick of her wrists. 3 weeks ago, the commissioner's office received multiple complaints about racial profiling in this district's traffic stops, she explained, her tone clipped and professional. Rather than launch a formal investigation, Dr. Thompson Marshall chose to experience it firsthand. His car was rigged with cameras. His phone recorded every interaction. The registration you questioned, it's under Marshall Industries' private consulting firm. And that ID you weren't allowed to see, his commissioner's badge. James nodded, his gaze steady as he surveyed the room. Tonight was a test, a carefully orchestrated lesson in justice and accountability. "I wanted to see how your department handles a black suspect who doesn't immediately bow to profiling. And you showed me exactly what I needed to know." Hayes wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling. "Dr. Thompson Marshall, I assure you." "Save it for tomorrow," James cut in, his tone firm but not harsh. "I'll be here at 9 a.m. sharp. We have a lot to discuss about reform." He turned to Collins and Brennan, who looked like they'd aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. "You'll both be there too. Tonight wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding. The real work starts tomorrow." He paused at Rodriguez, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Sergeant, good instincts on that phone call. You've earned a seat at the table." With that, he strode out of the station, Sarah and her team falling into step behind him. The black SUV waiting outside hummed to life, its tinted windows swallowing him from view as it pulled away. Inside, the officers stood in stunned silence, the weight of the night pressing down on them. A routine traffic stop had spiraled into a reckoning that would echo through their careers for years to come. The next morning, Pine Grove Station buzzed with a nervous energy that crackled like static. Officers Collins and Brennan arrived an hour early, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their shoes polished to a mirror sheen. They sat in the break room, clutching styrofoam cups of coffee they barely touched. Brennan's hands shook slightly as he spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "My wife couldn't stop laughing when I told her. Said it serves me right for jumping to conclusions." Collins stared into his cup, the dark liquid rippling faintly. "Do you think we'll lose our badges over this?" His words hung in the air, heavy with dread. Before Brennan could muster a reply, Rodriguez swept in, her uniform impeccable despite the shadows under her eyes. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the night's events in an endless loop. "Both of you, conference room." "Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. They followed her into the department's largest meeting space, where Captain Hayes was wrestling with a projector, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the cables. "The commissioner's office sent files this morning," Rodriguez said, dropping thick folders onto the table with a thud. "Read them before he gets here." Collins cracked open his folder, his fingers brushing the pages as he skimmed the contents. Detailed reports sprawled across the paper, traffic stop data from the past 6 months, broken down by race, time, and location. The numbers glared back at him. Black drivers were pulled over 3 times more often than white drivers in the same areas. "I don't get it," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "We were just doing our jobs, following protocol." Brennan nodded, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. The front desk officer appeared in the doorway, his voice tight. "They're here." Dr. James Thompson Marshall stepped into the room, a stark contrast to the man they'd arrested the night before. Gone was the casual jacket and calm detainee demeanor. Now, he wore a tailored navy suit that seemed to absorb the light, a crisp white shirt, and a gold commissioner's badge gleaming on his lapel. Sarah Martinez followed, her presence as commanding as ever, trailed by 3 staff members carrying briefcases and tablets. James's eyes swept the room, taking in the nervous faces, the unspoken questions. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and warm, but carrying the weight of authority. "Let's get to work." As he took his seat at the head of the table, Rodriguez watched him closely, her mind turning over the lesson he'd delivered. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about questioning who it served. Collins and Brennan sat rigid, their futures uncertain, while Hayes fidgeted with his notes, sweat beading on his forehead. For James, this wasn't just a meeting, it was the beginning of a reckoning, a chance to dismantle the abuses of power that had festered too long. And for the officers of Pine Grove, it was a lesson they'd never forget. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the precinct briefing room, casting long, golden streaks across the polished floor where officers stood clutching laptops and folders stuffed with papers. Their murmurs filled the air like a restless hum as they shuffled into place, awaiting the man who had summoned them. James Thompson Marshall stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without effort. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth yet resonant, carrying the same steady authority that had lingered in their minds from the previous night's unsettling encounter. It was a tone that didn't demand obedience, but earned it a calm that masked the storm brewing beneath. "I trust everyone's had a chance to pore over the preliminary data." Captain Hayes shot to his feet, his posture rigid with military precision, as if standing taller could shield him from the weight of the moment. "Yes, sir." Dr. Thompson Marshall. About last night his words stumbled, uncertain, but James raised a hand, cutting him off with a gentle firmness that silenced the room. "Before we dive into last night's events, I'd like you all to see something first." He glanced at Sarah, his ever-efficient chief of staff, who stood ready at a table cluttered with cables and devices. With a deft motion, she connected her laptop to the projector, her fingers moving with the quiet confidence of someone who'd orchestrated this moment down to the second. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in the bluish glow of dashboard camera footage from James's car the night before. The officers watched, their breaths catching in their throats, as their own figures appeared on screen, hands hovering near holsters, shoulders squared, eyes sharp with suspicion. The video wasn't just raw footage, it had been meticulously enhanced. Red overlays flashed across the screen, marking response times in milliseconds, while yellow text flagged behavioral cues and protocol missteps in real time. The data painted a picture they couldn't ignore, a mirror reflecting their actions in stark, unforgiving detail. James let the silence settle before speaking. "In the past year alone, this precinct has faced 17 complaints of racial profiling." His voice grew heavier, each word landing like a stone in still water. Every single one dismissed, swept away for lack of evidence. He paused the video, freezing the frame on Officer Collins's tense stance, his hand inches from his gun. "That ends today." The room shifted uncomfortably. Collins raised a hand, tentative, his fingers trembling slightly as if he were a schoolboy unsure of his place. "Sir, with all due respect, you were acting suspicious. Any officer would have." James cut in, his tone soft but piercing. Would they? With a click, the screen switched to another video. Same officers, same road. Just a week prior. This time, the driver was white. The difference was glaring. Hands rested casually at their sides. Voices carried a lilt of friendliness. The air lacked the crackle of tension. No red flags, no yellow warnings, just a routine stop that felt worlds apart. The room fell into a suffocating quiet. Brennan stared at his hands, folding and unfolding them in his lap, his knuckles whitening as guilt gnawed at him. Collins's face burned a deep crimson, his jaw tightening as he wrestled with the urge to defend himself. "I'm not here to point fingers or heap shame on anyone," James said, his voice softening, almost tender now. "I'm here because this precinct, this very room, has the potential to lead the way, to become a beacon of change. That's why I picked it for my first undercover operation as commissioner." Sarah stepped forward again, her heels clicking faintly against the floor as she handed out thick folders, each one brimming with charts, schedules, and bolded objectives. "This," James continued, tapping the cover of his own copy, "is our new training program. Over the next 6 months, every officer here will take part in workshops, be as recognition, community engagement, the works." Sergeant Rodriguez, a woman whose stern exterior hid a fierce loyalty to her team, spoke up, her voice steady but curious. "Sir, why let us arrest you? You could have flashed your ID at any moment." James's lips curved into a faint smile, his eyes glinting with something between resolve and sadness. "Because real change doesn't come from flipping through reports or nodding along to videos. It comes from feeling it, living it. Last night, every one of you faced a moment that upended what you thought you knew. You felt the confusion, the split-second choices, the weight of it all. That's where transformation begins." He crossed the room to the window, gazing out at the morning traffic crawling along the streets below, cars honking, pedestrians weaving through the chaos, a city pulsing with life. "Officers Collins and Brennan," he said, turning back, "your body camera footage isn't here to damn you. It's a tool, a lesson in how bias creeps into those fleeting decisions we make. Before we even realize it." Captain Hayes coughed, his throat dry with unease. "And the media, sir, if this gets out, it could bury the department." James met his gaze, unwavering. "They won't hear a word from my office. This isn't about airing dirty laundry. It's about building something better, starting right here, right now. The question is, are you all in?" The officers exchanged glances, their faces a gallery of emotions: doubt, defiance, a flicker of hope. What they'd thought was a simple traffic stop had spiraled into something monumental, a pivot point that could redefine everything they stood for. 3 days later, the county courthouse buzzed with an electric hum, its marble halls alive with whispers and hurried footsteps. Officers Collins and Brennan sat side by side on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3, their dress uniforms crisp but their nerves frayed. Collins tugged at his collar, the starched fabric chafing against his neck, while Brennan's leg bounced incessantly, a metronome of anxiety. "Something's off," Brennan muttered, his voice barely above a breath. "You see all these big shots rolling in?" Collins nodded, his eyes tracking the parade of polished shoes and tailored suit city council members, police brass, even reporters clutching notepads, their conversations hushed but urgent. Sergeant Rodriguez approached, her boots clicking with purpose, her face a mask of determination tempered by concern. "Hearings in 20 minutes, she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "Stick to what we went over, just the truth. Nothing more, nothing less." Inside the courtroom, Judge Eiler Martinez sat at her bench, her sharp eyes scanning a stack of documents. Known for her iron will and intolerance for excuses, she exuded an aura that made even seasoned lawyers fidget. She glanced at her phone repeatedly, her fingers tapping the wood as if counting down to something inevitable. Sarah Martinez darted through the crowded hallways, her tablet glowing in her hand as she directed people with the precision of a conductor. She'd transformed the courtroom into a stage, assigning seats like a director, placing actors every angle calculated, every view unobstructed. "Places, everyone," she called softly, her voice cutting through the din as she checked her screen one last time. The doors swung open, and the crowd filed in under her watchful eye. The mayor and police chief claimed the front row, their expressions unreadable, Behind them sat community leaders and activists, their faces alight with cautious optimism. Reporters, relegated to the back, grumbled as their devices were confiscated, their pens poised like weapons. Collins and Brennan were ushered to seats near the front, directly in the judge's line of sight. They spotted Captain Hayes and other senior officers in a cordoned-off section to their right, their uniforms gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise," and the room snapped to attention as Judge Martinez began. "Before we proceed," she declared, her voice slicing through the tension, "let it be clear, this is no ordinary hearing. What unfolds here today will ripple through law enforcement across the state." The double doors creaked open once more, and James strode in it in the commissioner's suit they'd expected, but in the worn sweater and pants from that fateful night. A hush fell over the room, thick and reverent, as he made his way to the front. "Dr. Thompson Marshall," Judge Martinez said, a rare note of admiration softening her tone. "Are you ready?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but warm. "But first, I want to thank everyone here for taking part in what may be the most vital police training exercise this city has ever seen." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Collins and Brennan exchanged a wide-eyed glance. "Training exercise." The judge raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Let the record reflect that this court has convened not for a criminal proceeding, but as part of an authorized training program crafted by Commissioner James Thompson Marshall." Sarah rose, her posture poised as she addressed the room. 3 days ago, Officers Collins and Brennan unknowingly stepped into a scenario designed to peel back the layers of unconscious bias in policing. Today, we'll dissect that night step by step with experts, advocates, and officers weighing in. The officers sat stunned as their body camera footage flickered onto massive screens, the room's collective gaze fixed on their every move. James took center stage, his presence now fully that of the commissioner, content, resolute, a man who'd turned a routine stop into a reckoning. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just about enforcing laws, but about confronting the flaws within those who wielded them, and the consequences of unchecked power. They reverberated far beyond a single night, echoing in the hearts of those who'd lived it and those who'd learned from it. In the dimly lit courtroom, the air buzzed with an unspoken tension as Officers Collins and Brennan sat stiffly, their navy uniforms crisp yet betraying the unease that flickered in their eyes. Unbeknownst to them during that fateful traffic stop months ago, every fleeting glance, every clipped word, every subtle shift of their hands toward their holsters had been captured not by a single dashboard camera, but by an intricate web of surveillance orchestrated by multiple agencies. This wasn't about pinning them with guilt or dragging their names through the mud. It was about peeling back the layers of human instinct and systemic flaws to reveal a truth far larger than any one person. The footage wasn't just evidence, it was a mirror reflecting the raw, unfiltered reality of fear and assumption that pulsed beneath the surface of law enforcement. Judge Sarah Martinez, her sharp gaze framed by silver-rimmed glasses, leaned forward from her elevated bench, the polished wood creaking faintly under her weight. Her voice cut through the stillness like a blade, steady yet laced with curiosity. "Dr. Thompson Marshall," she said, addressing the man standing at the room's center, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the officer's utilitarian attire. "You willingly thrust yourself into a situation brimming with risk. Was it truly necessary to take such extreme measures?" Her brow furrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in a genuine quest to understand the man who had turned a routine patrol into a seismic event. James Thompson Marshall met her eyes without flinching, then turned his head slowly to lock gazes with Collins and Brennan. The officers shifted in their seats, their breaths shallow, as if bracing for a reprimand. But James's voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much yet still believed in redemption. "Your Honor," he began, his tone rich with conviction, "real change doesn't come from sterile reports or distant theories. It demands raw, unfiltered experience walking in the shoes of those we claim to serve. We're not here to sling accusations or tally up faults. We're here to dig into the deep-seated biases that twist our perceptions, to unravel how they shape every interaction between law enforcement and the people they protect and, most crucially, To figure out how we can heal that divide together. The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the kind that presses against your chest, as every soul present felt the gravity of his words settle over them like a heavy fog. What had begun as an unremarkable traffic stop, an ordinary moment in the lives of Officers Collins and Brennan, had spiraled into something extraordinary, a cornerstone case that could redefine policing itself. The massive screens lining the courtroom walls flickered to life, casting a bluish glow across the faces of the onlookers. Grainy footage rolled, pieced together from multiple angles. James's sleek black sedan easing to the curb. Under the amber glow of a street lamp, the officers stepping out of their cruiser, their boots crunching against the gravel-strewn asphalt. The scene unfolded in meticulous detail, the way Collins's jaw tightened as he approached, the way Brennan's fingers hovered near his holster, the way James sat motionless behind the wheel, his hands deliberately visible atop the steering wheel. But this wasn't the same footage they'd seen before. This time, it came with a twist. Thermal imaging painted their silhouettes in shades of orange and red, while jagged lines of heart rate data pulsed across the bottom of the screen, a silent symphony of fear and adrenaline. James stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor, and gestured toward the screens with a steady hand. "What you're witnessing here," he said, his voice rising slightly to fill the room, "is fear not just mine, but there's two." He nodded toward Collins and Brennan, who sat rigid, their faces a mixture of discomfort and dawning realization. It's the fear that ignites before a single word is exchanged, born from the assumptions we carry like invisible baggage. "Look at this data." He paused as Sarah Martinez, with the precision of a seasoned lecturer, aimed a laser pointer at the screen, its red dot dancing across the spiking heart rate graphs. "See how their pulses raced the moment they clocked me, black man in a nice car?" Their hands edged toward their weapons, even though I gave them no reason to feel threatened. Collins squirmed in his seat, his fingers twitching against the armrest, while Brennan stared straight ahead, his lips pressed into a thin line. James raised a hand, his expression softening. "Officers, please, this isn't about shaming you. Your reactions, they're standard. Textbook, even. And that's precisely why we're here to confront what's normal and ask if it should be." The room held its breath as Judge Martinez leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing with intrigue. "Dr. Thompson Marshall," she pressed, "walk us through your role in this. What drove you to orchestrate such an elaborate operation?" James straightened his tie, a small, deliberate gesture that seemed to ground him. He took a deep breath, the air hissing softly through his nose, before speaking. 3 months ago, I was named the new police commissioner for the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. But I didn't just want the title, I wanted the truth. So I set a condition. Before I'd take the job, I'd go undercover, driving through cities across the country, experiencing firsthand how officers interact with civilians like minorities, who too often become targets of suspicion without cause. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The mayor, seated near the back, shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes scuffing the floor. The police chief's face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw clenching as if biting back a retort. "Your Honor," James continued, his voice gaining strength, "I've got a Ph.D. in criminal justice and psychology. I've poured 20 years into studying how police and communities collect records, statistics, interviews, you name it. But all that, it's a shadow compared to the real thing. That's why I climbed into that car that night, why I let myself be the one pulled over." He stepped closer to Collins and Brennan, his gaze softening with something akin to empathy. "These officers didn't break any rule, not by the book, anyway. And that's the heart of the issue. Our protocols, our training, they're built on a foundation that's cracked, and we've got to fix it." The screens shifted again, splitting into a side-by-side comparison that hit like a punch to the gut. On one half, James's traffic stop replayings, guarded, every movement laced with unspoken threat. On the other, footage of white drivers pulled over that same week unfolded in stark contrast, officers ambling, up with relaxed shoulders, hands dangling casually at their sides, voices warm and patient even when the drivers fumbled their words. James pointed to the disparity, his finger steady. "Look here with them. It's easygoing, almost friendly. But with me, A black man in a suit, driving a car that screams success. The air shifts. Danger's assumed before I even open my mouth. Sarah Martinez stepped forward again, her heels clicking sharply as she handed out thick, spiral-bound packets to the courtroom's occupants, officers, community leaders, all craning their necks to see. These, she announced, are the findings from 12 other cities. Same tests, same patterns, big departments, small towns, doesn't matter. It's consistent. Judge Martinez flipped through her copy, her fingers tracing the charts. Her lips pursed in thought. "And your solution, Commissioner?" she asked, her voice a quiet challenge. For the first time that day, a faint smile broke across James's face, softening the hard lines of his jaw. "That's why we're all gathered here," he said, sweeping his arm to encompass the room. "This isn't just a courtroom today, it's a training ground. For the next 8 hours, we're diving into every frame of that traffic stop, dissecting it with input from everyone: officers, community voices, legal minds, civil rights advocates." He turned to Collins and Brennan, who sat straighter now, their eyes flickering with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Officers, you're not defendants here, you were pioneers. Your experience, your honest reactions, they're going to shape training for thousands of cops nationwide." The tension in Collins's shoulders eased, his breath escaping in a quiet huff, while Brennan gave a small nod, his knuckles loosening around the armrest. From her seat near the front, Sergeant Rodriguez, a weary woman with a no-nonsense stare, offered them an encouraging dip of her chin. "Your Honor," James said, turning back to Judge Martinez, "with your permission, I'd like to kick off this training session, and I want to start by thanking Officers Collins and Brennan. They didn't know it then, but they've given us something priceless, a chance to rethink justice from the ground up." Judge Martinez surveyed the room, the officers fidgeting in their seats, the officials exchanging uneasy glances, the community leaders leaning forward with eager eyes, the press scribbling furiously in their notebooks. She saw it. No, James had chosen the stage, this public reckoning in a court of law. It wasn't just about exposure, it was about accountability, about turning the wheels of justice towards something greater. "Commissioner Thompson Marshall," she said, her voice ringing with authority, "you have the court's full backing. Proceed." As James launched into his presentation, slides clicking into place on the screens, Collins and Brennan exchanged a glance, a silent pact forged in the heat of the moment. What had started as a mundane night on patrol had catapulted them into the heart of a movement, a chance to rewrite the rules of power and consequence. And to their own surprise, they felt ready to step up. 1 month later, the Pine Grove police station bore little resemblance to its former self. The once drab walls now boasted vibrant training posters, their bold text preaching empathy and awareness. The break room, once a cluttered haven of coffee stains and gossip, had been transformed into a community hub, its tables ringed with chairs for residents and officers to sit side by side. But the real shift wasn't in the paint or the furniture, it was in the officers themselves, a quiet revolution simmering in their minds. Officer Collins hunched over his desk, the faint hum of his computer filling the small office. His eyes were glued to the body cam footage flickering across the screen, yesterday's traffic stops, each frame a lesson in self-reflection. He paused the video, rewinding to catch a moment he'd missed before, his hand, steady and still, resting by his side as he approached a driver's window. A month ago, that same hand would have drifted toward his gun without a second thought. He leaned back in his chair, a faint crease forming between his brows as he processed the change. "Getting better, isn't it?" came a voice from behind him. Sergeant Rodriguez stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, a rare hint of pride softening her stern features. She'd been tapped as head of community relations, a new role carved out by James's vision, and she wore it like a badge of honor. Collins nodded, scrubbing a hand over his jaw. "It's weird," he admitted, his voice low, almost confessional. "I never noticed how much I was doing on autopilot, little habits. Reaction subtle. I started watching myself every day." Down the hall, Officer Brennan stood before a room of fresh-faced recruits, their notebooks open, pens poised, the infamous traffic stop video played on a projector. But this time, Brennan didn't shrink from it. He pointed to the screen, his voice steady. "See my stance here. legs apart, shoulders squared. That's a threat posture. I didn't even realize I was doing it back then. The recruits scribbled furiously, their eyes wide with a hunger to learn, to get it right. Pine Grove had become a beacon in police circles, a name whispered with awe and envy. Officers from distant cities were clamoring for transfers, eager to soak up the new methods firsthand. In the station's community room, James sat cross-legged among a circle of resident Smithers clutching photos of their sons. Shopkeepers with weathered hands, teens with wary eyes. He listened, his pen scratching notes across a legal pad. As they poured out their stories of mistrust and hope, the lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just a gavel strike or a badge's gleam, it was a fragile thread, easily frayed by power unchecked, and it demanded constant, collective care to mend. Back at his desk, Collins replayed the footage one more time, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Brennan, finishing his session, clapped a recruit on the shoulder, his chest swelling with a purpose he hadn't known he'd craved. And James, surrounded by voices long ignored, felt the weight of consequence settle into his bones, not as a burden, but as a call to keep pushing. The traffic stop had been a spark, but the fire it lit was theirs to tend, a flame of accountability that could either warm or consume, depending on how they chose to wield it. Every 2 weeks, James made his way through the bustling streets of Pine Grove to the police station, his footsteps echoing with purpose against the cracked pavement. The air carried the faint scent of gasoline and blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. As he approached the squat, gray building, he wasn't just checking boxes. He was ensuring the seeds of change he'd planted were taking root, growing into something tangible. Last week, though, something unexpected had caught his attention, an encounter that lingered in his mind, like the aftertaste of strong coffee. An elderly black man, his voice weathered but steady, had approached him outside the station. "I got pulled over for a busted taillight," the man began, his eyes narrowing slightly as if bracing for judgment. James leaned in, pen poised over his notebook, sensing this wasn't just another complaint. But this time, the man continued, it wasn't like before. The officer was polite, took his time explaining what was wrong, and even pointed me to a repair shop down on 5th Street that wouldn't rip me off. James scribbled furiously, his curiosity piqued. "What's his name?" he asked, glancing up. "Collins," the man replied, fishing a slightly crumpled business card from his jacket pocket. "He told me to call him if the shop gave me any trouble." Never had an officer do that before. The old man's words hung in the air, heavy with a quiet astonishment that mirrored James's own growing hope. Later that afternoon, James found himself in Captain Hayes' office, the faint hum of a desk fan cutting through the stillness. The captain had undergone his own transformation. His desk, once angled toward the window as if he longed to escape the weight of his responsibilities, now faced the door, a subtle but deliberate shift. It was an invitation, a signal of openness that hadn't existed before James had stormed into this station 6 months ago. With a mission, Hayes slid a stack of papers across the desk, his weathered hands steady. "Take a look at these numbers," he said, a flicker of pride dancing in his eyes. "Complaints are down 60%. Community trust, up across the board. And here's the kicker, arrest rates for serious crimes are climbing. Not because we're cracking down harder, but because people are actually talking to us now." James scanned the stats, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just data. It was proof that justice could bend toward something better when power stopped flexing its muscles and started listening instead. "And the officers?" he asked, leaning forward. Hayes grinned, a rare crack in his usually stern demeanor. "Why don't you see for yourself?" He rose, motioning for James to follow him to the break room. Through the smudged glass of the break room window, James caught sight of Officers Collins and Brennan, their uniforms slightly wrinkled from a long shift. They sat across from the community leaders, people who, just a month ago, wouldn't have set foot in this building without a scowl. Now, laughter spilled from the table, mingling with the clatter of plastic forks against takeout containers. Collins, with his easy smile, gestured animatedly while Brennan nodded. His broad shoulders relaxed in a way James hadn't seen before. It was a scene so ordinary, yet so extraordinary. A fragile bridge built from shared meals and honest words. Commissioner Sarah Martinez strode up beside them, her tablet glowing faintly in her hand, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "Governor's office just called," she said, her voice sharp with excitement. "They want our training program statewide." CNN's sniffing around to something about the Pine Grove model. James turned from the window, his mind racing. "Tell them we'll do the interview," he said firmly, "but not just me. Collins and Brennan need to be there. This isn't my story aloneites, there's two." Sarah nodded, already tapping out a reply, her efficiency as relentless as ever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the station's parking lot, Collins caught Brennan by the arm before they could climb into their patrol cars. The air was cool, tinged with the metallic tang of exhaust. "You remember that night, partner?" Collins asked, his voice low, reflective. Brennan chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "How could I forget? Thought we were just nailing some shady guy with a busted light. Turns out we stumbled into something way bigger." Collins stared back at the station, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly against the dusk. "Funny thing is," he mused, "we thought we were the ones running the show, testing him. But he was testing using we flunked, didn't we? Flunked so bad we had to face ourselves." Brennan kicked at a loose pebble, his grin fading into something softer. "Yeah, but failing that test gave us a shot to fix it." As they walked off, their boots crunching against the gravel, they passed a freshly installed sign at the station's entrance, "Pine Grove Police Department, where community and law enforcement work as one." Below it, in smaller letters, was the date of that infamous traffic-stopped spark that had ignited everything. 6 months later, the city park buzzed with life under a sky so blue it seemed painted on. Hundreds gathered, officers in crisp dress uniforms, community members clutching coffee cups, media reps with cameras slung over their shoulders, and police officials from across the country, all drawn to Pine Grove like moths to a flame. Commissioner James Thompson Marshall stood at the podium, the wind tugging at his tie. Beside him sat Collins and Brennan, their new badges glinting in the sunlight, marking them as community relations training officers. Their story had transcended Pine Grove, becoming a beacon for what policing could be. 6 months ago, James began, his voice steady and resonant, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. A routine traffic stop didn't just change one night, it reshaped the future of law enforcement in this country. Today, we're here to celebrate not just what we've done, but what we've learned. He gestured to a massive screen behind him, numbers flashing in bold, traffic stop complaints down 75%, community trust soaring by 80%, crime prevention up 45% thanks to people who no longer saw the badge as a threat. The crowd shifted, a ripple of awe passing through them. "But numbers," James continued, his tone softening, "they're just the surface. The real shift is in the moments we live every day between officers and the people they serve." He turned to Collins, who rose slowly, his hands trembling just enough to betray the weight of the moment. The officer who'd once gripped his flashlight like a weapon now stood taller, his voice clear. 6 months back, I thought I had it all figured out. Being a cop was about control, about power. I was dead wrong. It's about understanding, about respect." He pulled out his phone, its screen lighting up with a new app the department had rolled out. "Every morning, I watch my body cam footage from the day before, not to spot trouble, but to find ways I can do better, listen more, judge less." The crowd leaned in, hanging on his words, as Brennan took his turn. "Last week, I stopped a young black guy in a fancy car," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of wonder. 6 months ago, I'd have rolled up suspicious, hand on my holster. But this time, I thought about that night with James. Turns out, the guy was a doctor, racing to an emergency. We talked and I escorted him to the hospital instead of writing him up." Applause erupted, warm and spontaneous, as Sarah stepped forward with more stats. 25 departments nationwide had adopted their model, with more signing on every month. James returned to the podium, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "The deepest change isn't in our policies or our number, sits in us, in our hearts." He beckoned Collins and Brennan to join him, unveiling 2 plaques. The first would hang in the station, etched with the story of that pivotal traffic stop. The second bore a new oath, crafted by officers and residents together, promising understanding, respect, and equality. This oath, James said, his voice thick with conviction, will be renewed every year, a reminder that growth never stops. In the audience, Sergeant Rodriguez sat with community leaders she now called friends, her stern face softened by a rare smile. Captain Hayes stood tall, his chest puffed with pride as his station became a national touchstone. Even Judge Martinez was there, her sharp eyes glinting with memories of the day her courtroom had doubled as a schoolhouse for reform. The ceremony closed with something unheard of. Officers and citizens reciting the new oath side by side, their voices blending into a pledge of partnership. Afterward, as people mingled under the lengthening shadows, Collins and Brennan found themselves surrounded by out-of-town officers, hungry for their wisdom. The toughest part, Collins admitted, his tone earnest, is facing your own blind spots. But once you do, you're not just a better cop, you are a better man. Brennan nodded, his eyes distant. That stop could have tanked me. Instead, it gave me purpose. From the crowd's edge, James watched, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. His undercover gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. Pine Grove wasn't just a reformed department, it was a roadmap for a nation. As the sun sank, casting golden streaks across the park, the station's new motto shone on badges and banners: protect, serve, understand. 3 words, simple yet profound, that had turned a mundane traffic stop into a quiet revolution that whispered a timeless truth. When power forgets justice, it crumbles. But when it bends toward understanding, it endures.